Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to another episode of Who's Who, Project 100 Profiles, brought to you by the Muslim American Society. I'm your host, Abdusalam Dawood Marshall. I'm so excited to welcome our guest today, Sister Tahira Wellman. Sister Tahira has over 14 years of experience in the medical field as a physician assistant. She specializes in internal medicine, cardiology, and medical oncology. However, in addition to working as a full-time PA, she's also pursuing her personal journey of Islamic education. So I can't wait to hear all about that. Sister Tahira has almost finished her first year at Boston Islamic Seminary, where she's part of the first ever cohort of master's students in that program. After graduating, she plans to work in the field of tarbiyah with youth, but long-term, her goal is to pivot into the hospital chaplaincy space, combining her experience and knowledge of the healthcare sector with her Islamic training. So Sister Tahira, welcome.
Thank you so much. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Wa Ramadan Mubarak to everyone.
Ramadan Mubarak to you as well, sister. So I can't wait to hear more about what you're doing at the Boston Islamic Seminary. And so I just want to ask you, here you are, this long and fulfilling career as a PA, probably working pretty long hours. Why on top of all of that did you decide, you know what, I want to go back and pursue my Islamic studies?
Okay, well, that's a very good question. So back in March of 2021, Mass National put on the first cohort of Project 100. And actually, it's an interesting story. I didn't even know about the production of this cohort like ahead of time. I think it was the night of the deadline that I got an email. And apparently, I guess maybe I must have overlooked like prior emails, and it must have been about like 9:30 at night or something. And it was like 12 a.m. was the deadline. And I decided to just fill out the application. I don't know, something inspired me and just motivated me to go through that very long, lengthy application and complete it. And something inside me just said, you know, you really need this spiritually, you really need this. And so I decided to go for it. And alhamdulillah, I just never looked back. And it's just been a constant, like, committed effort since then, spiritually for me.
Alhamdulillah. You know, I had a similar experience myself, got that application last minute, and something moved me to do it. And I've just met so many wonderful people through that program. So there you are, you're a P100 sailor, you're part of that program. And then from there, how did you hear about the Boston Islamic Seminary, and what made you decide to, you know, take the jump from, you know, being in this program to now being fully immersed as a graduate student?
So I completed that first cohort, and I had a wonderful group that I worked with in terms of my small group. And after that first cohort, I actually participated in the following cohort and then the third cohort. So I did 3 back-to-back cohorts. In the first one, I was just a student participant, and I was just kind of taking everything in, doing a lot of reflection in my own spiritual journey and how I wanted to change like my practice of my faith. And each cohort that I did, I felt so much growth within myself and just a different sense of purpose in my life. So the second and the third cohorts, I was actually a project leader like of our small group sessions. And I wanted that development to continue. So Project 100 is wonderful. I feel like each cohort has its own unique angle on spiritual development that everybody experiences. And even if you do more than one cohort, you still continue to grow. However, I wanted to actually have more of a like concentrated didactic experience of like filling in the holes of my own Islamic knowledge that I was able to fully recognize and be humbled by actually by doing the Project 100 programs. So I felt like I couldn't turn my back on that. I felt like, you know, it became kind of like an amana upon me, like that I had to fulfill within myself for my own like purification and my own development, but also for my role as a parent, because I have 2 pretty grown sons right now, and you know, my family, my extended family, my community. I just felt more of a sense of like responsibility that I couldn't take a backseat role anymore in what I can give to my community, society, and you know, just yeah, that's pretty much what happened.
MashaAllah. So it really was this community or calling towards community. You mentioned that there was, you kind of went through this transformation, or you realized that you needed to go deeper in your connection to Islam. And that maybe part of that is connected to your role as a mother, wanting to raise the next generation of Muslims. But what else do you think? Why now, I guess, in life? Why now make this change?
So I'll speak to a very personal experience. As a healthcare provider, I was on the front lines and I was treating patients that were suffering from COVID, and many of them died. I was part of that first wave of healthcare providers on the front line treating patients. And I dealt with a lot of morbidity and mortality related to COVID. And I think it affected me personally, psychologically, spiritually. And it made me realize that, life is not promised, time is not promised. I think that sometimes we get so caught up in the busyness of our lives, and we constantly make an excuse that we don't have time. But again, it goes back to like Surah Al-Asr, and time is just not promised. And I just couldn't give myself any excuses any longer. And I just felt that I needed to do something about it. I felt the need to act. And although being a healthcare provider is a lifelong effort and kind of devotion to service, I still felt that there are a lot of people in the world who aren't yet Muslim, who haven't yet received the message, who are suffering, who their souls need to be, awakened by what we have to offer in terms of this deen, and sharing our message with them. And we're just not doing enough. I felt like I'm not doing enough. I wanted to start with myself, not blame others. And I felt the only way that I could effectively do more is to first edify myself in terms of my own Islamic knowledge before I could go out into the world and actually be, an ambassador of that.
MashaAllah, sister. May Allah reward you for the work you're doing out there saving lives. And may Allah reward you for this next phase in your life where you're not just saving physical lives, but also, inshallah, enriching spiritual lives. That's so impressive. So walk me through kind of a day in your life nowadays. You're still working full-time as a PA, and you're also a seminary student. What's it like being a seminary student?
So the first semester was a little rough. There was some adjustments. As you said, my schedule for work is very hectic. I work 12 and a half hour shifts. So I was able to kind of scale back the minimum requirement for being a full-time employee and do just the 3 shifts. And I kind of made my schedule around the seminary schedule as best as I could. And on the days that I didn't work, I basically had to make up for the readings and all of the assignments that we had to do for our coursework. So I took 5 courses last semester. One of them was a distinction course, but we started with the fundamentals of trying to kind of build a foundation of knowledge with some of the initial like Islamic sciences that one would study in an Islamic seminary. So my coursework included Aqidah, which is like the fundamentals of faith. We took another course which was called Living the Quran. So it was kind of like a course that one would take after understanding like the initial sciences of the Quran, like a general overview of the sciences of the Quran. And then how do you implement that in terms of actually extracting from the Quran as you're memorizing it, as you're studying the tafsir of it, and reflecting on, the verses that you're reading and the surahs and what kind of like, how do you apply that to life, like your everyday living? So that was called Living the Quran. And then another course I took was the Introduction to Fiqh. So the fiqh course is basically about jurisprudence, and we talk about different aspects of worship and transactions. That was that first semester. So fiqh is actually a science that we study throughout the program, and it just builds on itself. So the first semester was just about transactions and worship. And then I took a course about the modern worldview. That was taught by Dr. Sharif Al-Tubri, and it was basically studying the juxtaposition of the modern worldview as opposed to the Islamic worldview, and how do we now like reconcile maybe values that we've adopted from the modern worldview because of living in a Western world? How do we kind of filter that, through our own understanding of our own faith? And then let's see. So that was 4, I believe, right? And then the 5th course was the distinction course, and that was talking about contemporary religion in America. So that was interesting. We talked about issues related to mostly the Abrahamic faiths we focused on, but kind of like modern day issues that are kind of in competition and kind of challenge belief systems currently. So there were a lot of different interesting, like current day, mostly like current events type of things that we discussed in that course. And that was taught by Dr. Celine Ibrahim, which it was a wonderful course too. Yeah, so each offered a different aspect of kind of building on development, spiritual development, and kind of filling in, like I said, a lot of those gaps in my knowledge that I didn't even realize that I had, growing up and so on. There's a lot that we take for granted when we're like born and raised Muslim and we think we know things, but then we have to kind of deconstruct. When you learn traditionally, you kind of have to relearn everything the proper way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is, I mean, that program sounds intense, but amazing. I'm ready to sign up myself. That is awesome. You said a few things I'd love to kind of get deeper into. As you said, it sounds like one of the main elements of that program, as well as something that we talk about in P100, is this kind of balancing of the Islamic worldview and our modern contemporary lives. In our secular modern societies, how do we reconcile that, as you said? I'm intrigued by this course about the living Quran, right? It's not just about memorization, but really extracting meaning and putting it into action, putting it into practice.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, our model for that is the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who was described as a walking Quran himself. So I'm curious, through this course, through P100, through your own experiences in the medical field and elsewhere, how do you, in your day, try to inhabit the Quran and to try to live in the way that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught us to? How do you try to put that into action? What does that look like for you?
So, okay, before I answer that question, I want to go back, and I did have one additional course so
That
the
wasn't
Aqidah
enough. You have
course,
more.
I know. So the Aqidah course was actually combined with the modern worldview course.
Okay.
So it was kind of all in one. So that's how I kind of lost count. So the 5th course actually was called Sunnah of the Messenger, and we actually studied the science of Hadith. I'm sorry, that was also an extremely important foundational course, and that was taught by Dr. Hassan Lechib. So yeah, and then that's the complete program. Okay. So with respect to living in the way of the Prophet, so that's a very difficult question, and I think it's a lifelong process to try to emulate his life as much as possible.
Yes.
So I would say knowing the Quran and knowing the Prophet, like studying the Quran and studying the Prophet's life, I think are the 2 fundamental ways to begin to even try to do that. I think many of us have abandoned the Quran in many ways. Even those of us who were born and raised Muslim, we don't necessarily turn to it regularly the way we should. I think that sometimes we turn to it in our lowest moments. We turn to it when we feel we just need that rescue, kind of that like last ditch rescue kind of situation, but it's not meant to be that way. It's a book of guidance that is supposed to be part of our daily like living, and I think one of the things that I've learned as a seminary student is how important it is to inculcate that like in my life on a daily basis. So actually making the Quran part of my ritual practice every single day. And that was one of the things that we were kind of compelled to do with the Living the Quran course. So every day we had to read a certain portion of the Quran. Whatever time of the day we chose to do that, we would have to kind of sit in that space and have a stillness and reflect on what we read, and then also respond and react to that in terms of writing and reflections. And so that created a foundation of tarbiyah in my life that I constantly endeavor to do even now. Even though the course is finished, it's something that I've realized has enhanced my life and kind of set the tone of my day on a daily basis, and brought a level of peace actually to my life. So I think that that's the first thing that I've actually implemented from my studies. And then in terms of studying the seerah of the Prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and learning about his life, and then taking the time to also reflect on his life, and the sort of takeaway points that we can draw from that, in terms of how to live life in the modern day, which is difficult because there are certain things that are very unique to our current time that may not, be comparable to his time. But I think that constantly making an effort to consciously and mindfully, just reflect on what would the prophetic example be in this situation? Like,
Right.
How should I be the best ambassador of living his message, now, in this situation, whatever the situation is. And so that mindfulness, I think, is a big part of living in the way of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it's an ongoing journey. And I think the more that we learn about his life, and the more we study the seerah, and the more we study Islamic science in general, all of the Islamic sciences, I think the more we're able to genuinely perfect ourselves, our character, purify ourselves, and more so embody the prophetic message. So the more we know, the more we can do that.
Absolutely. I think you said something so important there about creating space for stillness in our lives, and how that's so lacking in the kind of modern contemporary lifestyle, which is all just about producing more, consuming more, adding more and more and more, and just the need to take time, take space for that self-reflection, for that spiritual development and growth, and that consciousness to raise. How do you seek to do that within your own family? You mentioned your mom. You've got 2 sons. How does this take root in your own family in terms of tarbiyah?
So currently, my eldest son, he actually lives in Virginia. He graduated college 2 years ago.
MashaAllah.
And his job, he had to be on site, so he's in Virginia. The younger son, he's actually finishing college, and he'll be done in May, inshallah. So they're kind of not in the household right now, but when they have come to visit, and when they have been in my presence here, I've made more of a conscious effort for us to pray together, if we're not going to the masjid, obviously. And for us to do reflections together. We also try to do some sort of halaqah, at night together. Usually, sometime after Maghrib prayer, we'll do some sort of halaqah and reflection. So I've tried to make my home more of an example of, that spiritual focus, and trying to actually reflect and take a moment, like you said, of silence and reflection to kind of decompress the world and shut the world out for a moment, and just focus on, our own relationship with Allah. And so I think also them just seeing kind of my efforts, and the fact that I am so busy, in my work life, but I'm still making time for this. I think it has inspired in them more of an interest, and more of an openness to do a little bit more in their own lives in terms of their own religious practice. So that's what I would say now. And they're witnessing my own growth. I share things with them a lot. I share articles, I share video clips, and then I ask them about those things. So I'm a teacher at heart. I actually was a professional teacher before I went into medicine. And so there are moments as a mother that I go into teaching mode with them. And sometimes they like it and sometimes they don't, but they don't have a choice. So yeah, so I think, just kind of making those openings for teaching moments and having those discussions with them. But now that they're like young adults themselves, they're men now. I can have, deeper conversations with them, and it builds a different kind of connection with them. They're like companions now, more than this dynamic of parent to child, where like they're my adult offspring, basically. So yeah.
Well, they are so blessed to have you as a mother and as a role model. And you're really inspiring me. I've got 2 younger children. And right now, it's a joy to pray together and have these short moments of reflections and stories, but to grow in our knowledge together, and to, as you said, have halakas and create space for reflection is really inspiring. I know a lot of us, we try to do that, especially during Ramadan, but to carry on that practice throughout the whole year, and not just for the month of Ramadan. That's wonderful advice.
Yes,
well, I mean, sister, you're doing so much. And I want to ask you a question. We've got a segment called Minute to Win It. And so I'm going to ask you for one piece of advice, a minute of advice for our listeners. You are a full-time professional. You are also a student in an Islamic seminary. You're also a mom. How do you do it? So the question I want to ask you is, how do you achieve this work-life balance?
So I have to say it's a constant challenge. I think that, in the modern era, productivity is constantly hammered, into our lives in the workplace. And I think that it is a conflict of values sometimes. So in the workplace, it is difficult. However, I make the prayer times the moment of my kind of like sacred space. So I'll speak like in the hospital setting when it's time to pray. Of course, in the safest way possible, I make sure that my colleagues will cover my patients and so on, and that I'm covered on that end. But I find a quiet space in the hospital, and I put down my rug and I make that time to pray, my sacred time. And after the prayer, I don't rush. I don't just like jump up from the prayer and then get back to work. No, I take a few minutes to sit there. I do my tasbih, I do my dua, and I may not always be able to do sunnah prayers, but I make sure that I do those things. And I take time to just, talk to Allah, ask Allah for assistance to help guide the rest of my day. I take time to kind of reflect and just decompress some of the day. And it's, that meditation time, if you want to call it meditation, non-Muslims will call it like mindful meditation or mindfulness or whatever. We just call it like tasbih, tadabbur. We call it other things, but it's the same thing. It's just packaged differently. And actually the way that we do it is even more meaningful because we're actually giving thanks to God in the process. But I just take that time out, and it refocuses my day. Even if, my day again is like this pressure of productivity, I think structuring your day around the prayers and just giving yourself that time out period, where God is the greatest in that moment. And you just sit with that, other things that busy our time and busy our minds, they're important to a certain extent, but God is always the greatest. And so when we sit down and we say the takbir in our prayers, it's part of what we say when we pray. Like, what does that actually mean? So actually to take out that time out and use the prayer as kind of like breakout times in our day, no matter what our day looks like, is very important. And I think that's a way to carry through, just that spiritual focus of like, what is our purpose? Our true purpose is to worship. Our true purpose is to give back thanks, and to be mindful always, no matter what's going on.
That's beautiful. And I completely agree. I mean, Islam has given us a built-in work-life balance through the gift of Salah. And maybe it's called wellness nowadays or mindfulness, but we call it taqwa. And that's just really beautifully put. I appreciate that. I'm going to be greedy. I've just asked you for one piece of advice. I'm going to ask for another quick, short piece of advice. We might have a lot of listeners out there who are contemplating maybe continuing their Islamic education, maybe going to do an advanced degree. Maybe they're even thinking about the Boston Islamic Seminary specifically. Do you have any quick advice for listeners who may be interested in pursuing advanced studies in Islamic education?
Sure. So I think that it depends on where you are in your life. I think if you're, quite young and you don't have dependents and you don't have multiple kind of things that are demanding of you, if you can take out the time to actually go on site to a seminary program, I think it's always best. There's nothing like being in the physical presence of your teachers. And even though the virtual space as a third space is a wonderful alternative, I still feel that the best way to augment and kind of magnify the blessings of the learning experience in terms of your spiritual journey is to actually be in the physical presence of your teachers. However, if you are a working professional and your life situation doesn't allow for that, I think looking for remote learning options is wonderful. I think that you do have to compare seminary programs. Each program kind of has its own focus. So the program that I'm currently attending, Boston Islamic Seminary, is designed around not only building a strong foundation in the Islamic sciences in the students, but also kind of developing them as leaders. So making them spokespeople for the deen, enabling them to give da'wah in the public sphere. And so we have a heavy focus as well on like public speaking, public engagement, writing, writing articles and so on to be shared in the public sphere. So it has kind of a multidimensional focus in that respect, but not every seminary is like that. So I think just kind of studying the differences of what each seminary program has to offer is really important. And then just looking at where you are in your life and what you're able to do, like in terms of like sacrifice of your time.
Right. That's great advice. And no matter where you are in life, you can make time for it. It'll just look differently depending on your context, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. If I can do it in medicine, and medicine is very demanding, even if you have to do it as a part-time student, it's not a race, it's a marathon. And, every day is another opportunity to enhance ourselves. And sometimes it just takes more time for some than others. And that's okay. I think it's the intention and it's the effort and it's the long haul overall that helps to kind of like transform us, and sometimes it takes time for that process as well. So I'm taking it as it comes. Alhamdulillah, this is what works for me. And the balance of both, like I said, is always a challenge. It's an ongoing challenge, but it's one we ask Allah for guidance through every day and to help kind of facilitate our learning and our journey through it. Yeah.
Alhamdulillah. May Allah grant you tawfiq in all of your endeavors, sister. It's been such a wonderful pleasure and honor to speak to you. As we close out the show, I wonder if you wouldn't honor us with a brief dua.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا أو أخطأنا ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار ربنا إننا آمنا فاغفر لنا ذنوبنا وقنا عذاب النار ربنا آمنا بما أنزلت واتبعنا رسولا فاكتبنا مع الشاهدين ربنا إنك من تدخل النار فقد أخزيته ما للظالمين من أنصار بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر.
Ameen. Ameen. Jazakallah khair, sister. We hope to see you again and talk to you again soon, inshallah. In the meantime, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.